Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another screencast with your teacher, Mr. Stano. And today we're going to talk about water pollution. If you remember back to when we were talking about oceans and our ocean fisheries, there was a method to fish or farm fish known as aquaponics. And in that system, wastes from fish were pumped up into plants for them to help break down any of the waste from fish, and then that water would be able to get recycled back, and we had that cycle with a number of bacteria present. We were able to naturally, in this little self-contained system, keep it going and naturally break things down. So there is a possibility for wastewater to get cleaned naturally using everything from the sun, plants, snails, zooplankton, and fish itself to kind of keep that going. It's just the scale at which we need it. Can we get it to work? And that's a little bit, that is probably one of the biggest issues with it. There are a couple of different types of water pollution. We have point and non-point sources. Now remember, water pollution is basically any chemical, biological, or physical change in the water quality that has a harmful effect on us and other living organisms. Point sources of pollution, we can identify the actual place where that pollution is being generated, such as drain pipes or sewer lines. Non-point is somewhere where we can't trace the pollution back to a single source, but maybe due to a number of different areas contributing to that pollution, such as we see in agricultural runoff, residential runoff, or even in industrial cases sometimes. These are just some common diseases transmitted to humans through contaminated drinking water. So we have bacterial, virus, protozoa, and parasitic worms. Some bacterial forms of contamination could be cholera, typhoid, or even dysentery. Viruses, we could look at hepatitis or type B from the contaminated drinking water. So these are just some different types of contamination that we can come across, usually associated with unsanitary conditions around water supplies. One of the things that we test for to make sure that our water supply is in decent standards are fecal coliforms. The bacteria, the Enterococcus bacteria that is present in the fecal coliforms is what we are testing for. And if we see that, then we most likely know that there is some sort of pollution or threat to that water supply. We can also look at our dissolved oxygen levels. Our dissolved oxygen ranging anywhere from about 8 or 9 parts per million going down to below that will show some issues. So water quality and dissolved oxygen definitely have a very close relationship with each other. What we have noticed with flowing streams is that they usually have a little bit quicker time to bounce back. One, through dilution and the fact that their movement helps dilute that source, and over time will actually produce what's known as a dissolved oxygen or an oxygen sag curve, which we'll go over in the next slide. So moving streams, a little bit due to the rates of dilution that they have, will basically rebound quickly from any sort of pollution versus a standing water such as lakes or ponds. But let's take a look at the curve coming up next. So in this curve here, which I would definitely get down, we have our point source pollution. And you can see our dissolved oxygen, roughly 8 parts per million. So the organisms that we see here, things are fine. And our biological oxygen demand, or BOD, is quite low. Remember, we've talked about this before with bacteria. As they break down stuff, they're going to consume some of the oxygen in the water. So if there's not much for them to consume, the activity is pretty low. Our pollution comes in. Notice our biological oxygen demand jumps up as that bacteria and those decomposers have something to eat and break down or decompose. Their BOD will be high. Now, as their activity increases or keeps going, your oxygen levels are dropping. And basically, what ends up happening is as we get a little bit farther and farther away, this gets diluted, and some of the stuff in the water will actually get broken down. Their activity decreases. At the same time, we'll have a little bit of decrease in oxygen until finally we're getting to our recovery zone. At this point, decomposition is pretty low. as we can see here, and will remain low, and then time will go on, and we'll get our distance away from that point source of pollution, and our oxygen levels will bounce back up to where they were previously, or hopefully. And at each stage, whether we're in a decomposition zone, septic, or recovery zone, you can see there's a number of different fish that we see in that area. And that's our oxygen sag curve that's associated with a point source, or with a point source pollution source that will give something for decomposers in that area to feed on. Definitely a pretty important curve. I would get this one down. We can see pollution of freshwater streams differing a little bit depending on where we are, whether we're developed or we're in undeveloped countries. But typically in our developed countries, point source pollution is not as big of an issue as what it was, but chemicals leaching in or non-point sources are still a problem. Where there might be some industrial, but really agricultural sources right now is a big issue. And we're not also mentioning hydrofracturing, which may also be a potential issue here too. Stream pollution, typically in undeveloped countries, is going to be an issue, especially sewage waste getting into that, and industrial waste too, as their standards or regulations may not be as high as ours. This is just looking at a river within a developing country, and you can see that all this debris that we have floating in this area. And this is just what we can see, not including some of the other stuff that might be in there, or the other pollutants that might be in there. India, the Ganges River, has a interesting problem because of its symbolism within that country. It's one of the massive rivers, but between religion, poverty, and just the health of the people there is definitely an issue. So what we end up seeing is a huge amount of life centered around this river. And we see that sewage ends up going into this water. Poor people are really affected from that. So bodies get cremated or put out into these areas too. Decomposing bodies promote disease, and basically is going to deplete that dissolved oxygen. Remember, as something breaks down in there, those bacteria are using oxygen to do that. So just religious beliefs in that area, combined with health things, with their sanitary system of sewage being pumped into it. A little closer look. So then 1 million Hindus within the Indian population bathe, drink from this water, and carry out religious ceremonies. So you're looking at a huge amount of activity around one water source, be it with religious practices, poverty, inadequate, or the infrastructure for a sanitary system not really being up to par, and it gets pretty highly polluted. Freshwater lakes, like I mentioned, do not have the ability that streams do to rebound as quickly. They can, but not as good. So what ends up happening is that because lakes are pretty much standing, there's very little mixing, so we don't really have a dilution of a source, and we end up getting a stratification of these lakes. And just like we see with the Long Island Sound, we'll have a very low dissolved oxygen content towards the bottom with this very little mixing, and at the top it's usually okay. We can see the same in lakes too. And also runoff in these areas, just like Long Island Sound, makes them susceptible to those lower DO levels or a higher BOD. Which brings us to these terms that we have talked about before: eutrophication and cultural eutrophication. Eutrophication, basically just nutrients naturally making their way into a lake, a shallow lake, and ultimately what ends up happening with those nutrients, we see algae growth, and ultimately dissolved oxygen drop as that algae gets consumed by other decomposers when it dies. Cultural eutrophication, we're just adding to it. We've accelerated the input of nutrients into those lakes, ultimately ending up with lower DO levels and higher biological oxygen demand levels. Groundwater is an issue. If we were just talking about our groundwater, especially in Long Island here, groundwater from those three aquifers, Upper Glacial, Magathie, and Lloyd, if contaminants do get into it, is a huge issue, and we'll show in the next slide here how those plumes move with groundwater flow. But it's a good thing because it's a little bit harder for those areas to get polluted. They can, and typically, depending on the type of contaminant, the sediment itself, the contaminant will have an affinity or an attraction towards certain sediments, and maybe even cause the plume to not move at all, stay put, or may actually cause it to move. So it's a very tough situation to look at, and it's more complex than what it turns out to be. But typically, groundwater is a little bit harder to pollute, but if it does, then we do have an issue. So what we can see in this diagram here and in one coming up is just a number of different sources that can cause pollution to our groundwater supplies. So if we have a waste lagoon, right here, we can have some leaching into unconfined aquifers, and then that plume can move into a pumping well or distribution well for a local water supply. De-icing road salt can also run off into any sort of bodies of water. Pesticides, fertilizers can make their way down. Typically, though, de-icing road salt, pesticide fertilizers will run off into a stream and potentially get into water supplies that way. But it can leach into our groundwater sources. Landfills typically have a leachate collection system. On modern landfills. Older landfills or dumps will not have that lining system, and you will get leaching into groundwater supplies. Sewer systems, same thing. Any leaks within the sewer system will make its way into possible groundwater supplies, and that's what we have to worry about. Now, whether it's a confined or an unconfined aquifer will change a little bit. Remember, those confined aquifers, it's very hard for either contaminant to get into them, or in some cases, non-existent for them to get in. So they're a little bit more protected. But remember that clay, or if it's a silt type of confining unit, maybe will allow some contaminants to get through. So they're not 100% protected. They're just better protected. And you can see here, just from this diagram, just a number of other effects or sources that can potentially contaminate groundwater sources. It could take, if a pollutant does get into a groundwater source, it may take a very long time for it to cleanse itself. We see this under the Brookhaven National Lab site, where a number of different contaminants have gotten into their supply. They've mapped them, and they are able to fix it, but naturally, those contaminants will not dilute very quickly and may take hundreds of thousands of years, depending on that groundwater flow, to either get diluted enough so that it's acceptable or break down over time. There are some things that will degrade, such as DDT. Will take time, but it depends on the persistence of that chemical. Non-degradable wastes, we can look at lead, arsenic, fluoride. Once they get in, they're there for a while. This is how a pollutant will move. So we have our gasoline storage tank right here, and now if it has a leak, it'll cause a plume. It's a term to know. Now this plume will move with our groundwater flow. The issue with our groundwater flow is if you have a well, then you'll be pumping in this water. Notice the cone of depression around the well right here. And depending on how this groundwater flow is, and this all depends on the sediment that makes up that aquifer in the area, it may move in different ways. But you can see that gasoline, it'll vaporize and could make its way into basement. So we have a number of different issues here. So the gasoline causing that plume, dissolving in that, they're moving with that groundwater flow, possibly vaporizing, going into households, or getting pumped from wells. So Brookhaven National Labs, what they've done is set up a huge amount of monitoring wells to look at these plumes, their movement, how fast they're moving, and where they're moving, and also taken everyone off that area, off private wells, and put them on a public water supply so that they are safer. But the cost to Brookhaven National Labs has been huge because of very similar situations. So leaks from a number of sources have contaminated groundwater in parts of the world. It has happened, happens here on Long Island and parts of the United States. And it takes a huge amount of money to clean up. According to the EPA, though, one or more organic chemicals contaminate just about half of the municipal groundwater supplies, which we test for, and they are things that we have to look out for. Arsenic can naturally occur in rocks if we look at it a natural threat and high levels in soil. So what can happen here is by drilling into aquifers, it helps move it or put it into those water supplies. So that's something to worry about. And the World Health Organization has just estimated that over 100 million people are drinking water with arsenic levels that are 100 times higher that they may be. These are just some solutions that we have to cleaning up groundwater supply or preventing stuff from getting into. So you can see here, require leak detectors on underground tanks. So if there is a leak, we can respond to it quickly and assess and clean that area up. Monitoring wells are huge, and we see this here, especially with a public water supply on Long Island. We do have these monitoring wells, and they're especially in and around sites where we possibly think contaminants might be or have been found in the past, so that they've been cleaned up. Definitely one of the bigger ones. Just find our substitute for toxic chemicals, keeping them out of the environment. Just a number of things we could do. This is what we, as far as cleanup, pump to the surface, which we do at Brookhaven National Lab. So if we see there's a plume, we go to the forefront or the head of the plume where it's moving, and we can pump from there. We pump it up either into a number of different areas that will clean it, or technologies that will clean it. Sometimes it might be a zeolite type filter. Charcoal is another one that can be used. I know these are massive, but whatever the case may be, then the water is discharged into a recharge basin to get back into groundwater supplies. So that's just one way that's typically what we can see, but once again, the costs are pretty high associated with all of these. Okay, that's about it for now. We'll go into ocean pollution in the next screencast. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Take care.